Hello there, and welcome to History Chats. Hey, it's been a bit here. I have a question for you. Why do we call the city of Schofield Schofield? It's not usually how I start these, but it's kind of an interesting question. Just real briefly, for those of you who might be wondering, we took most of 2024 off from doing History Chats, which for a long time, almost 4 years ago, we started doing as a weekly program every Thursday. But Gary and I needed a little bit of a break, so we took a bit of a hiatus. But I couldn't resist the opportunity to just kind of do one more here, squeak it in before the end of 2024. I'll maybe get into a little bit later about, towards the end here, about the future of History Chats. But for now, I think we have a question. So let's see if we can dig into it. I like this question. Why is it called Schofield? Why do we call the city of Schofield Schofield? Because I think that it is one of those questions that's pretty easy. And I think anybody can, if they think about it, it's an interesting question, right? Why do we call the places that we call them by those names? Like at some point, somebody had to decide this is going to be Schofield, and, we called it Schofield. So when does it happen? And where does the name come from? This is a bit of a trivia question that, you might know the answer to. You might not. If you don't, don't worry. I'm going to go into it at length here. But I think it's worth kind of examining the initial answer, because I think if many of you, like me, before I really started digging into this a couple weeks ago, kind of assume you know the answer. And you're not necessarily wrong to think, as most histories and websites, if you search online or crack open a book about Marathon County history or about Schofield specifically, they're not shy about saying the reason it's called Schofield is because of this guy. This is William Schofield. Dr. William Schofield. He is a physician, born in Ohio, ends up getting a medical degree there, moves to northern Illinois, where he practices medicine for a little bit, before, sometime in the 1840s, giving all of that up to move to Wisconsin and become a lumberman. Now, ultimately, he will become the head and in charge of a sawmill that is operating on the Eau Claire River here in Marathon County, just a branch of the the Eau Claire feeds into the Wisconsin River, a little south of this place that they were calling Big Bull Falls at the time, but soon will become Wausau. And it's because of his association with the sawmill, which he helps to build, that we call it Schofield, right? This is the answer that we often get. It's a very short and straight to the point answer. But just for the sake of it, let me explain a little bit about how complicated this can get. Because at the end of the day, despite what we've been saying for years, the chronology doesn't always line up. Like, there are some sources, like Louis Marchetti himself, in one part of his book, which is pretty big, right? Lots of different things. And in certain places in his book, he will say that the Schofields moved to Schofield in the 1840s when they built the sawmill. Then in other sections, he will say that, hey, they moved here in the 1850s and they bought the sawmill. And this is pretty common. So to give you an idea, I'm not going to go through the whole nuances of all of the specifics of what if and what could be, but here is, as far as I know it, some specifics, and this will give you a taste. This is the census, a page from the census taken in 1850. 1850 is an important year for us here in Marathon County because earlier that year, we became a county. So previously, I was going to say in the 1840 census, we would have been counted as Portage County, but I don't know Portage County would have encompassed this area at that point. It's a lot of changes, right? This is all before statehood and all of that. But in 1850, we are a state, right? And Marathon County has been created. And so this is the first section. And actually, if I zoom in a little bit, you can even see there is no cities or villages at this point in 1850. And there really is just one township, which is called the town of Wausau. Later in the 50s, we will start to separate out other townships to keep track of some of the rural land there and even incorporate a village, maybe. Who knows? But here in 1850, we can see this. So basically, you're just kind of going by, the order they're doing it is the order of the people. So when they got to this area down here, This is the part we're looking for. We can see who's living in what we will eventually call Schofield, because despite some of the sources that say that the Schofields don't even come here until the early 1850s, he's here in 1850. This is William Schofield. He's listed in the 1850 census here. He's listed as a lumberman, given up his practice as a doctor. He's 41, he's born in Ohio, and he owns $3,000 worth of real estate, which is more than pretty much anybody else on the page, right? The other people that are listed here are also important, and this will kind of give a way to give an insight into the early history. Let me point out not him, but the last person on the page. This is Jesse Martin. Now, Jesse is credited with, depending on what you're looking at, this is him later in life. He ends up originally settling in Stevens Point, has a little store there, but he and his brother end up making a go of it by going up to the Eau Claire River. And again, the Stevens Point resources, like if you look at the newspapers, they will say that they built the mill, but they didn't build a mill. There was another interest that about 1847-48 had gotten started by a partnership of Houghton and Batten, who don't stick around very long because they end up selling the interest in the sawmill that they had kind of started to the Martin brothers. And the Martin brothers then in 1849 or thereabouts sell the interest to William Schofield, who is also kind of associated with the Stevens Point area. We'll get into that in a second. But he is going to be the mill owner, right? And whether he built the mill, he didn't. There was a mill there. But he certainly did improve the mill. And then ultimately he will build a new mill after a fire destroys the old one. Now, in this at least initial instance, we're often given credit. Some of the sources will say that he didn't do this alone, but he's joined by his friend, who is listed underneath him here. This is Captain Lombard. It was apparently a friend that they had made in Illinois while he was practicing medicine and had come up with him and taken on the venture with him. Now, this is notable for a couple reasons. One is the spelling. Almost no source, like Louis Marchetti doesn't say Simon, he just says Lombard, and it's not spelt here Lombard. And the reason that I put that is because, the few instances of the newspapers talking about him that I could find say Lombard. So either way, pretty close. He is also not listed as owning any property here, which doesn't necessarily mean that he's not a partner in the venture in 1850. But at least according to the stories that we tell in the histories, he's an initial investor, but then he will, after the fire later in the 1850s, basically sell his control of the company directly to Schofield, who will rebuild. But he is still here. This is a thing talking about his death in the Wassa Pilot in 1881. So he does live in Weston at that point. And this is all happening in Weston, by the way. The town is Weston, but the community that we know as Schofield would have been part of that, but hasn't come into being. But it's starting to, because of this guy. So, slightly longer answer. Why is it called Schofield? Because of William Schofield, right? He comes here in the 1850s, and whether he's there in the 50s, in the 40s, whether he built the mill, whether he bought the mill and improved it, he's pretty good at what he does. That seems to be the consensus. He is somebody who apparently is credited with bringing the first rotary saw to the area. He's also, one point that was pointed out at one of the sources that I found said that there was a bit of a financial panic in the late 1850s, and Schofield was unusual in that he was one of the few lumbermen in the area that didn't lose their shirts in the whole venture. So he had a sound financial footing, a lot of pine going through the mill at the Eau Claire River there under Mr. Schofield. But he's not living there all the time. Because again, like the Martins, the community that we will eventually call Schofield is basically just a boarding house and a sawmill. There's not a lot there in 1850. And in fact, about 1855, we know this. Oh, by the way, this is the sawmill. It was about 1860. So this is not the one that was originally there. This is the one that they rebuilt that would carry over through the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and then, well, we'll get there. This is the state census. So Wisconsin did a separate census halfway between the federal censuses. This is 1855. And this is the pages from the Portage County area. And in the, at this point, town of Stevens Point, it's not a village or a city yet, it's just the area that is going to become Stevens Point. We can see that there is a William Schofield. So he ends up moving his family. You know, the Eau Claire River is a nice place to make some money, and he certainly has his hands full running the place. But once you have kids, maybe you want them to be in part of a community. And you know what? This is a thriving area. Stevens Point is the growth area in the 1850s. You know, Wausau is also going to grow, but Wausau doesn't become a city until 1872, whereas William Schofield is living in Stevens Point in 1858 when they become a city, right? And they actually jump straight from unincorporated, like it says here, past the village. Usually you become a village and then you grow into a city. They just go straight to a city. He's living here, by the way, with there's more than one person. The state census is a little contracted, so they don't say like these are all the people and their ages and where they're born and all of that. They just keep track of how many people. There's a column for white male, white female, not white male, not white female. And in this case, there is a single male living here. That's William. And then there is two women. One of those women is his wife. So in 1852, we know he goes back to Illinois, and there he marries Mary Hazeltine. And then they move up to Wisconsin and make a life at the Eau Claire River there. But yeah, once they have their first daughter, they decide maybe they don't want to, you know, raise their children, of which I think they'll have 5 when all said is done. Maybe Stevens Point's a better place for that, so they end up moving down there. And William has a little mercantile business that he starts down there. Also, the whole bit where I was talking about why they became a city, that's relevant because in 1858, when they become a city, they suddenly have to elect a mayor, right? You don't have a mayor in a town or a village, but now you do in a city. And guess who they elect mayor in 1858? Well, the first mayor of Stevens Point is Dr. William Schofield. He's reelected to that in 1859. And then in 1860, they're 1-year terms, and I think there might be a 2-year term limit. That or, you know, maybe by 1860, he didn't want to run again. Certainly he had other things like the mill up in Stevens, up at the Eau Claire River, and his store in Stevens Point to keep him occupied. He's also not doing well health-wise. We don't really know specifically. It's not terribly important, really, what was ailing him, but he had a long ailment that was, you know, kind of came and went. And, you know, it was a shock when it finally did lead to his death in 1863, but also not that much of a shock. Like, they kind of knew that his health had been kind of iffy. But he does die in 1863. This is the obituary run in the Wisconsin Lumberman, which is actually a new newspaper that started. This is the very first edition, I believe, in December of 1863 of this weekly. I think it was a weekly. And yeah, it includes the obituary for Dr. William Schofield. I'm not going to basically read through it. You can pause, and this is kind of the meat of the description here. But basically they say, you know, he's a beloved member of the community, right? He's very good as a businessman. He's very good as a civic person. He's got lumbering and mercantile, and he was really good about helping to develop the area here. He has contributed greatly towards advancing the interests of this locality. So there you go. The community, though, continues, right? Even though, you know, he dies in Stevens Point, eventually his body will be exhumed and moved to the community that he helped to found on the Eau Claire River, which is growing. The mill continues after his death, and ultimately it will incorporate its village onto itself in 1904, and it will adopt a name for itself as Schofield. So, what have we learned? It's named for Dr. William Schofield, right? I think we could also make the case here, I'm just going to throw out there, that Mary Schofield deserves a bit of a credit. Most of the history is going back, tend not to acknowledge the importance of Mary Schofield, but I will tell you, an amazing woman who deserves a lot of credit. Honestly, probably could be a whole program onto herself. And I'm not going to really do her justice here, but understand, definitely deserves a bit of a credit, a great deal of credit for giving the name. But ultimately, they say they share the same last name, so, you know, it's named after them, right? But then this brings up the other question. Like, this is fine, but often in those, like, answers to the trivia question, why is it called Schofield? There's the other question that it brings up, right? Because they don't spell their name the same way that the city of Schofield currently is used for, right? Like, if I bring up just out of, you know, here's their website for the city of Schofield. Well, that's a different, that's not the Schofield spelling, the L there. So if Schofield is named Schofield after the Schofields, why is it spelled differently? Here's the thing. Those trivia bits that here's the quick answers, the Louis Marchetti's, in his telling of the story, there seems to be a simple answer that's given. And I don't think it's a wrong answer, to be clear. But the answer is, well, it was Schofield. It's named after him. And by the way, I'm going to say Schofield from now on. It's not pronounced that way. It's just Schofield. But I'm going to pronounce the L just for clarity. Anyway, the family is named Schofield. William Schofield is the guy who started it. Therefore, it is named originally Schofield, but the village dropped the L at some point. Or maybe a post office worker somewhere just made a mistake. Or maybe it was intentional. Maybe they thought the extra silent L here would be confusing, and so they just streamlined it. And again, I don't think that that's a wrong explanation. I think that that's probably valid and as close of a good of an explanation as we can get. But here's the thing. If we keep digging and ask the question, sure, it happened, but why? Can we figure out when it happened? Why it happened? Who made it happen? Well, this is an interesting, wrinkle, right? So if you, as I did, want to dig into it, well, here's what you might be able to find. I think part and parcel with this is an inherent question that this asks as well, which is, how does a official spelling emerge? Like, at what point can we say that there is an official spelling? And what's unofficial? Well, let's look at some examples. So I mentioned that Schofield incorporates as a village in 1904. Now, sometimes the story, like Louis Marchetti will say the village of Schofield. That's how he spells it in his book. But it's Schofield in 1904. But we'll get to that in a second. The point is that until 1904, when they incorporate as a village, right, there is no such thing as Schofield from a governmental point of view in a lot of the ways, right? From a municipal perspective, there's no village board. There's no representative. Your representative on the county board of supervisors would have been from Weston and not from Schofield, because Schofield isn't a place yet. We can see this actually pretty clearly illustrated by this chart that was included in the Wisconsin Blue Book in 1905, basically showing the results of the votes cast for various candidates for governor in their races in 1904 and 1902. And I've highlighted it here, but here is Schofield. It appears with that spelling, right, as a village. Oddly enough, it's not in alphabetical order within the S's, but it is within the rest of this, which is an odd choice, but okay. So how many votes are cast? Well, in 1904, after they became a village, it's 144 votes that were cast. And in 1902, there are none, because there was no Schofield in 1902. Now, there was the streets, there was the buildings, there were the people that lived there. They might have also voted in 1902, but those 144 voters would not have been counted as Schofield because it doesn't exist. And instead, they would have been added to the larger total of the town of Weston, in which the village would, be incorporated out of. So my point here is to say that, like, if you're looking at election statistics, like election voter rolls, or, basically any sort of governmental recognition of like where somebody is from, you will not find Schofield as an entity in a municipal sense. But it is a place, right? So what are the land records? What about the real estate? Well, this is a plat book from 1901, which is an interesting year. Typically what they do is this, so plat books are usually used to keep track of like who owns what farmland. So if we like zoom in, you can see a lot of this land are, big blocky bits. We do lines that are going to be, completely east to west, parallel, north, south, these big squares that we can use to encompass this, the acreage, right? So these are like 40, 80 acre plots of land. And it's really great for that. But when you get into a community that has city streets, like if we zoom in up here on Wausau, well, in the city of Wausau, it gets more complicated because we're not keeping track of the ownership of properties in the acres, but like square feet, a couple hundred square feet. That's like your yard and the house that you build on. So they don't bother doing that most of the time. That being said, we're mapping the whole city or the whole county, so they do include the shaded areas indicating that like there's the city part of this. Now what's interesting in 1901 is, and here's Schofield down here, which I've added the blue, similar thing. 1901 is interesting because, you didn't see that. There we go. Because they do something that they didn't say in 1882. This is the first plat book that we can find in 1882. They don't do a plat book like a published book before this point. And just to make it more confusing, back here it's Schofield, as we would come to understand the spelling. But in 1882, if we look at this and clean it up a little bit, it says Schofield. But that 1901 book, right? It's unusual because in addition to the full township and township range numbers, like these big 6x6 mile chunks of land, they also did a special thing where they incorporated village and city maps. So I showed this before. I don't know if I think I took it out. This is Schofield. And when I saw this, I was like, oh, cool, it's a village, right? It's laid out like a village. We have, we can zoom in, we can see the streets, we can see the original plat and additions. That's usually stuff you see when a city, like here's the original village limits, and then as they expand, they add additions, right? The thing is, though, this is actually from the 1901 plat book, which means that this is not the village of the village of Schofield, because there is no village of Schofield yet. That won't happen until 1904. So, and if you look closely, you find that it doesn't say village anywhere on here. It's just Schofield, and it's in Weston Township. It says original plat. It doesn't say the original village plat, as which we might refer to it, because it's not a village. But it's still here. So the reason I mention this is because as I was looking at this and going, this is confusing. What did they originally say? Because you can bet that in the land records, they didn't say original plat. They would have said original plat of something, right? Because there's an original plat of the village, or what become the village of Edgar. There's an original plat for the original village that is Wausau. So you got to start somewhere, and they're not going to put into the record original plat. So what did they use? And more importantly, what spelling did they use? Let's look at that original plat section. So I figured if I go to the county courthouse and the Register of Deeds, I can track down that answer. And so I did. Kind of. I didn't actually go into the building and talk to anybody. I was going to, but then I was doing some research and realized, I can get that information online. And I went to their web portal and I paid about $6, I think, for this image to download it because they have it scanned. Cool. This is the original map for the village, or the original platting for Schofield. It's created in 1882. First, let me point out there's all this scribble writing here that's very hard to read, especially at the size that you're going to see this. I thought about blowing it up. I'll just tell you. It basically says this. This map and the survey attached to it are submitted to the county and state of Wisconsin, Marathon County and the state of Wisconsin, on behalf, by the city engineer for the city of Wausau, a guy named C.W. Nutter. And Nutter has been doing this on behalf of the landowners in the village, or what will become the village, the original platting here, which they say here is Mary Schofield and Charles P. Hazeltine. Hazeltine is Mary Schofield's brother. We'll get to that in a bit. So they own the land. They petition him. They say, map it out, and then we submit it. And the reason for this is because, if you think about those big, 40-acre chunks, it's a lot easier just to say, I want to sell someone lot 4 in block 1 of the original plat of Schofield. That's what you do. This doesn't mean that it's a village. It's not an entity unto itself. This is all within the larger confines of the town of Weston, but it makes it a lot easier to describe this because you're not having to relate this to the basically the fourth prime meridian, like one of the fundamental ways to divide the entire globe, which is essentially how we do the other thing. But I'm not going to get sidetracked explaining that. I've done that before, and you can look into that if you want. The more point here is that this is put into the record. This is the first instance that the land is laid out as what will become the village, but with the streets, the blocks, all of that. Schofield goes back to this. If you buy a property in this piece of land today, it will be said to be part of the original platting of Schofield. And what a name, right? Schofield. Now, again, one of the theories is that a government person, a surveyor or somebody at the village or the post office or somebody in the government made a mistake. They dropped the L intentionally or unintentionally. And I'm here to tell you this is not the fault of Mr. Nutter. Because he's doing this on behalf of Mary Schofield. So if Mary Schofield saw that, she would have caught if the name was spelled wrong. It's her name. She had the opportunity to tell them, hey, nope, wrong spelling. No, this is already well established as being the spelling for Schofield in 1882. Otherwise, they would have fixed it. So that's kind of interesting, right? Okay, so we can't use the governmental thing because the entity of Schofield doesn't exist until 1904. This is not a situation like say, the town of Spencer, right? There was a town of Spencer, and then there was a village of Spencer that's incorporated out of it. But both still exist. That's not the case here. There wasn't a Schofield that then created a village of Schofield, and then the rest of it became Weston. No, it was always Weston, and this just came into itself. In the same way that, like, the village of Rothschild is part of what was originally Weston, right? So it's not an entity as a municipal sense. And it's also not an entity in a legal sense from real estate, right? Because this is the earliest we can go back. You go back, you're not going to find any platting of the word Schofield because it doesn't exist. So what else can we use then? What about the post office? Post office is older. There's post office service. If I am working at the sawmill in the 1870s or the 1860s and I get a letter, what are they addressing that letter to? Where's my address? This is care of a specific post office. So what is that? Well, okay, let's look at that. This post office is one that was served Schofield for many years. This was built in, I think, 1961. This is not the first. To get the first, we need to go back to the first postmaster that served this area that we trace back to, and that's a guy named Stephen Durkee. Okay, there's a lot of things here. I'm going to try to go over his career very briefly, but essentially he had moved his family here in the 1850s. In 1861, he joins a group of men going down to Wisconsin Rapids, Grand Rapids at the time, and he enlists in the cause to fight in the Union Army in the Civil War. He then joins and serves for the next few years as part of Wisconsin's famous Iron Brigade, and this takes him up to the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 when he is grievously injured. I don't know the specifics here, but he couldn't walk, he could barely move. He spent some time in a bunch of different camps and hospitals, and then eventually he recovers miraculously the ability to walk and to get around and to get do some stuff. He never really do hard labor after this point, but at least he could walk. That's the important part. But he was not really in any condition that they were going to put a rifle in his hand and say, all right, get back on the line. We need to win this war. No, you've done enough. So he gets sort of a medical furlough and he goes back home to Wisconsin. He buys a plot of land up in Marathon County, south of the Eau Claire River, but on the coach road that went from Mosinee to Mosinee up to Wausau. And about 1864, the people in this little community that he's now living on, where his log cabin is located in the vicinity of the Eau Claire River here, south of Wausau, they ask, hey, could, the coach road is bringing all this mail up to Wausau. Could you just drop off our mail here, closer to us? We have a post office, right? And the Postal Service says, yeah, all right, sounds good. So they create a post office. And as the first postmaster, it's basically out of his home. They don't build a dedicated building. He just has, the front room of his log cabin. He just kind of holds onto the mail, and then people come and get it. So we can see then the first post office, and this is the 1865, the first time that this would have appeared in the official list of post offices in Wisconsin. And it is listed as, well, it's not Schofield or Schofield, but Sherman. Yep. It's named, presumably, seems to be understood after this guy. This is General William Tecumseh Sherman, who is a major general in the Union Army during the war. This is the era in which, in the late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, we see a lot of places across the Midwest, northern sort of western region, being named places like Lincoln County, for example, or Grant or Sherman. So there you go. So from 1865 to 1875, for the 10 years that he was postmaster, Durkee is the postmaster it's at his home, which technically is what we would consider today the village of Rothschild. It's kind of down near like Shopko, where that little mall plaza is, I think, somewhere around there. So it's not quite the Eau Claire River, where the village of Schofield would eventually be incorporated, but it's pretty dang close. And just to prove this is a map from 1871 showing Wisconsin and Michigan's post offices and railroads. And you can see here all the post offices listed. Got the Germans up here, Naugart, Maine, and Stettin, the homesteads coming up there, Marathon City. And then you have Sherman. It's not quite on the Eau Claire River there, but it's just below it. So this lasts for about 10 years, but it serves the mill and the community that's emerging around it. But let's go back and talk about that mill, because also while they're petitioning the opportunity to to establish a post office for this community around the Eau Claire River and the mill here, well, who's running the mill? Because 2 years earlier, 1863, William dies. Well, here's Mary. Like, one of the reasons that it'd be valid to say that she is the namesake for Schofield, even more than her husband, is because she takes over running the company. She moves the family back up to the Eau Claire River, and she not only keeps the company running during the war, and will continue to be involved with it for many years going forward, but she also really is responsible for the fostering of the community that emerges around it. But yeah, the sawmill. It's not under her name, though, for very long. The Schofield Mill may be because of the lingering consequence of William's name attached to it, but as we get into the 1870s, it will be under her brother. As I said, Charles Hazeltine. He is also in the Civil War. He serves out of Illinois, 91st Infantry or something along those lines. He had been at the Siege of Vicksburg at the end of the war, gotten commendations for bravery and all of that, and after the war, he gets out and comes up to Wisconsin and helps his sister run the sawmill. And he ends up becoming kind of the face of the sawmill itself and the business manager and kind of making things run smoothly, which he seems to do quite well, right? He's also the next postmaster, I'm pretty sure. Now, I don't know this for 100% certain because the chronology and the succession of the postmasters is unclear. But around 1875, Durkee gives it up, and the postmaster is now going to be Hazeltine, I'm pretty sure. At any rate, it definitely moves out of that log cabin, a couple miles south of the area to Schofield, or the future Schofield proper. And they adopt a new name at this point. Why not? Schofield's Mills. So on one hand, we have Schofield enter the picture for the first time, and I would say if there is an instance in which there is the misspelling that gets established, it's probably here. This is the official postal name for it, Schofield's Mills, which is a mouthful. Here it is on a 1879 map, Schofield's Mills, no apostrophe. And actually, there's a lot of variance in terms of how you might write it out. I think they would all get to the right place, but sometimes it's not Mills, plural. Sometimes it's not Schofield's. Sometimes it's Schofields. But effectively, this is essentially what it is. And officially, the Postal Service has it listed under that standardized spelling, Schofield's Mills. Because that mill is the center, it's the most important thing in the community. That's what most of the people living there are working with or for. And if you're passing through, this is like the landmark as you cross the bridge and head north to Wausau, right? So I think people had kind of come to see it as, hey, that's the landmark. And so, yeah, go past Schofield's Mills and you'll get there. Um, it's also worth noting that if Hazeltine is the postmaster, the stories that I found say that he is operating the post office out of his home or possibly his office. So part of the reason that they might have said Schofield's Mill is because it's not just in Schofield, it's at the mill. Like the mill is where you would go. And actually, they had consolidated some larger service that comes out of this. So I don't know that for certain, but that's one other suggestion here. The mill, though, is not named Schofield at this point. It's not William Schofield's been dead, and even though Mary Schofield is still very much a partner in the operation, she has been relegated. I mean, this is the 1860s and 70s after all, so C.P. Hazeltine and Company is the official name of the lumber company. The company here is, the and company is Mary. This is actually the top of some letterhead that I found in our collection. The full letter is kind of boring. It's just a bunch of like arithmetic that they sketched out. But I think the letterhead is interesting. Pine, lumber, lath, and shingles. Kind of cool. Also, there's some interesting locations attached. Like, where do you write to? Well, you write to Schofield Mills. It's the 1870s, right? But also, the telegraph office is listed as being Schofield, Wisconsin, as part of the Wisconsin Valley Railroad. So this brings up another point that I'm not going to travel down. This is going to be a long enough video as it is. You could also look at things like the telegraph office and the stops of the railroads, because those would also be places that we would see a spelling being enshrined. But what I think I've largely come across is that they might have Schofield, like in the 1870s here at the telegraph office, but as time goes on, they're going to default to the post office's spelling, right? Even though there are railroad maps showing, in the 1870s, them calling it Sherman, I think, at some point. I think I found one. Sometimes they're Schofield, sometimes they're Schofield's Mills, sometimes they shorten, they add. It's Schofield's Mills in one map that I found that went all the way into the 20th century. So they're not operating under the most up-to-date information. And ultimately, I think, as we'll see over the long haul, we default to using the name that the post office uses as the government official recognition there. That being said, it doesn't stay that way forever. A couple of important things happen in 1882, right? Firstly, I've already mentioned this, the village plat, or what will become the village, the official platting of Schofield is established, right? So I think that Mary and Charles recognize that, we want to see this develop, so we're going to put the effort into lay it down so that we can sell more properties because this is a growth area. They also move the post office, I think. I don't know the specifics of what exactly happens here, but in 1882, they also do petition the government, not only to establish a platting in the real estate sense, but also to change the post office. And so this is the official list of names in the Blue Book in 1882, and it lists now simply Schofield. And again, note the simplified spelling. It's not Schofield, it's Schofield. Something else happens of note in 1882. There's another fire. It's a thing that happens with sawmills on an alarming basis. In this case, it is pretty destructive. A fire breaks out and it destroys the entirety of the Hazeltine mill. $4,000 not insured, loss of $4,000, no money in insurance coming from that, 225 men thrown out of employment. That's tough. Part of me wonders, by the way, if maybe the change from Schofield's Mills to Schofield is because the mill burns down, but I don't know if that lines up chronologically. I don't think it does, but maybe. That being said, they do rebuild, but in the aftermath of the burning of the mill, a couple things here. One, they move move the actual mill. The mill that gets replaces it is actually like the original sawmills were basically along where the river crossing there. Like if you're driving to Schofield and you take Grand Avenue, as you cross the Eau Claire River, that is essentially where the community was, and that's where the sawmill was. But now that that's been burned down, they have moved further east into the area that will eventually become the starting point for the industrial park later in the century. This is closer to where the railroad access is and a little bit more room for them to build a bigger facility. This is also going to be done not by Mary and Charles, but by Charles. Hazeltine buys out his sister's shares, and he becomes the sole owner of the sawmill and yard. And not too long after this, into 1883, as he starts to rebuild, his health is not doing great. And he's been cautioned by people saying, you need to get out of this, or you're not going to be around much longer yourself. And so he takes their advice, and he sells the interest in the company, and it is passed then to the hands of a partnership of Brooks and Ross, two local folks involved in the lumber industry. They will end up running the sawmill well into the 20th century. Although here's the third fire. There's another fire that happens in 1910, destroys much of the mill, and at this point Brooks retires and John Ross rebuilds under his own. But still, the point is, we could continue to follow the ups and downs of the sawmill or the post office, but I think at this point you get the idea, right? We have a community. It has been established. It's now definitely Schofield by the turn of the century. And it's that spelling. So, but okay, let's try to regroup and reevaluate. Now we've learned a lot more about this. Why is it called Schofield? Is it named after this guy? Kind of. I think maybe a better way to wrap this up is actually to come at it in a different direction. Not why is this called Schofield, but, why not? Specifically, why not Weston? Right? The town of Weston had been in existence in 1860, and actually, I didn't really get into this, but there actually had been a post office for Weston predating the Sherman one in 1865. This is the post office list, and there's some interesting stuff here. Jenny and Gemmicon, which are apparently in Lincoln County. Lincoln County doesn't exist at this point. Not going to get into that. In Marathon County proper, we have Knowlton, Mosedy, and Little Bow Falls, which is interesting. Wausau, and Weston. But the thing is, that Weston post office is not in Schofield, where it will become Schofield or Rothschild. It's actually further east. It's about 6 miles east at a place that will be largely associated with the Kelly brothers. And in fact, by the end of the 1860s, I think, in the in the 1870s, by the 1870s or somewhere around there, they rename it to the Kelly Mill or the Kelly brothers or Kelly, and then eventually it gets kind of wrapped up into the Schofield Mills post office. So, but there had been a Weston already, and I think that this actually kind of gives you an idea of why they didn't go with Weston. Weston didn't refer to any of these individual communities, but the general area. Because there were the Kelly brothers operating their mill, because there was Brawley operating his, because there was Mr. Schofield operating his, it didn't really become associated the name Weston with any one of them, but all of them. And so they all kind of would have incorporated and led to their own communities in their own right. So that's why it's not Weston. Kind of similarly, Eau Claire, there's the obvious in that there is already a city of Eau Claire in Wisconsin. It's not already at this point. In the 1850s, it's still pretty new, but clearly that's what they're going to call it. Here in Marathon County, it's not particularly popular in the 1860s, 50s, 60s, 70s to name your community after a geographic place. Like, we're trying to get away from the Bull Fallses, right? It's not Big Bull Falls, it's Wausau. So they just decide, and again, like early on it was Eau Claire, but that was just kind of when we're using the river as like, it's when the Eau Claire or the Rib River or the Trap River, that's what we're just going to call the community around where the river splits off. So, but they don't do that. Similarly, Sherman, right? We have a post office, it's a unique name. It's not competing with an existing place, right? Well, about that. See, like I said, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's a lot of places that adopt the names of Civil War figures, politicians, generals, and some of them stick. In fact, today there are 4 places in Wisconsin that are incorporated, or not incorporated, that are in on the books as have being named Sherman, Wisconsin. They're all towns, so they're not villages or cities, but yeah, there's other Shermans. And I think ultimately the people in what will become Schofield don't really identify with Sherman. Sherman is the name of the place where the post office gets delivered, the postal service gets delivered. It's not the name of the community. And as a result, they just never really connect with it. And instead they, use the mill. But why didn't they stick with Schofield's Mills, whatever spelling or iteration of this? I will just say because it's a mouthful. It's a lot. And Schofield's Mills. Ugh. It's a lot simpler just to drop the Mills. It's Schofield. But the mill is also an interesting point because, like, by the time that they're calling it Schofield's Mills in 1875, William Schofield's been dead for 12 years. And yet Mary is still very much involved. But, like, this brings up another question, which is why not Hazeltine? Like, C.P. Hazeltine, he is the guy running the company. It's associated with him. It's his name on the company. Why does it never shift to become Hazeltine? And for this, I can only speculate. I think Hazeltine was a great businessman. And I think in certain circles, he was particularly, popular, right? But not everybody liked him. I mean, I don't think he was that sort of guy. He's not William Schofield. He doesn't have the sort of, he's not going to be elected mayor, right? He's running a good company, but ultimately he's overshadowed in the sort of social sense, by his sister, right? Mary Schofield, on the other hand, beloved, not only in Wausau, but down in Stevens Point, where she lived briefly, and, in Wausau and Schofield, right? She, again, there's a lot you could say about her. She starts the school in Schofield. She, gets church services. Up in Wausau, she's a charter member of the Ladies Literary Society. She's very active. And I think that ultimately, it's the Hazeltine Mill, but we're just going to keep calling it Schofield's Mill. That's what they do. Even after it becomes Brooks and Ross, apparently, into the 20th century, they still call it Schofield's Mill sometimes. So, it's back to this, right? Why is it Schofield? Well, it's named Schofield because of these people. Now, I think the interesting distinction, and you'll forgive me if I'm being pedantic here, is Schofield named after them? Or is it named Schofield because of them? If it's one, then it's the other. But I don't think that anybody sat down and said, hey, I'm William Schofield. I built this mill. This community is going to be named after me. I don't think that's the case. And I don't think Mary was like, this community that's emerging is going to be named after my family. I don't think so. If that was the case, they would have insisted on calling it Schofield, or rather Schofield, a lot earlier. They don't. There's also something to be said about, is the spelling important? Just as an example, we have a binder of genealogy from the Schofield family, and this is the title page. And they have 4 different spellings of Schofield. The Schofield family, which are still very much around and they're in the area today, the descendants of William and Mary, many of them still have the Schofield spelling that they do. Not all of them do. And I think that, the consensus from other reporting on this and everything seems to be that, it's enough that the name is the same. We don't need the L to be there in order to know the importance of the Schofield family to Schofield. Now, arguably, I think that you could also say the answer to that trivia question, why is it Schofield? It's the mill. The mill's existence, because the family built it, and ultimately this all takes us back to William and Mary, but even in the 20th century, like I said, this is like one of the first aerial pictures taken in central Wisconsin, and there's the mill, and I think you could probably show this picture to somebody in the 1920s, and people would still probably call it Schofield's Mill, even though it's not Schofield. There's a reason, I think, that a lot of the books still go back. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you can't say that William isn't the namesake. I'm saying that the interesting thing here isn't that it's named after him. It's that it has become even if in the 1860s and 70s they didn't intend to name the community that was growing on the Eau Claire River here Schofield after him, that actually doesn't undo the idea that it is named after him, right? Because by the 1920s and well into the 20th century, as people in the village and then the city of Schofield, which incorporates as a city in the 50s, this is the history book they put together. There's the sort of acknowledgments page, and then on the first page, what do we start with? Well, a little bit from the mayor, saying from that day, Dr. Schofield set up the first commercial business to furnish supplies and staples for the sawmill and the people. Schofield has grown and prospered with a large industrial area and a growing commercial area. Yeah, it's a picture of Dr. and William Schofield, Dr. and Mrs. William Schofield, and then there they are. Like, that means something, and that's not to say that silly, they don't understand that it's not actually named after them. It is, because we make it about them. But I think what's cool is that you could also make the argument that it's not named after the Dr. Schofield, but Mary, or not any of them. The family, for the mill. It's kind of cool. And I think ultimately this is one of the cool things, and the reason I wanted to do this, even though this is a long this is basically History Speaks at this point. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to go a full hour, but I guess I've been a little out of practice. Usually I'm pretty good at keeping this to half an hour, but it's been a few months. This is the history of Schofield. And again, back to that initial idea, why is it called Schofield? This is a pretty good opportunity to dig into this. And if we really want to dig, you can learn a lot about how communities emerge, and the connections between even outside of the county, to Stevens Point and Schofield and Wausau, the people, and how the post office gets started, the involvement of the Civil War. There's a lot crammed in here, and I didn't even really pull at all the threads, so kind of cool. Yeah. So there you go. That's the history of Schofield, I guess. Like I said, it's been a while since we've done one of these. We took a good chunk of 2024 off to give Gary and I kind of breathing room and kind of evaluate how we want to go forward. I think we don't really have a explicit plan that I can say this is what's going to happen in 2025, but I will say this. We will be back in 2025 with more history chats. It won't be a week-to-week, every Thursday at 12:30 thing, I'm pretty sure. I think it's going to be more like this. This is a whole question that I got sent on. I had got an email a couple weeks ago from Julie at the public library saying, hey, do we know when the L got dropped? And I was like, oh yeah, I can figure that out. And here's this whole story. I don't know that I could have sat down and said, I'm going to do 50 minutes on the history of Schofield before going down that path. So I think that the basic idea, the philosophy going forward will be, when Gary and I, or maybe other people, have an opportunity where we're like, this is a story we want to tell, then we'll put together a video. We'll do a live stream. We'll do whatever. More likely, I should say this. In addition, I do have some sketched out plans for mini-series. Maybe a couple weeks in a row, we'll have a video that we'll put out. What the heck? I'll commit to doing the two that I have kind of outlined that I will probably do in 2025. One is a series talking about the 1920s in Marathon County, told through some unusual little bits and pieces that connect. Having fun putting that one together. And it's something that I really wanted to kind of dig into and develop. So that'll probably be coming in January at some point. And then at some point this year, I also want to kind of dig into, in 2026, we will be celebrating 250 years of the United States of America, since July 4th and the creation of our country. And, as we approach that date, we need to start thinking about, hey, what is it that we are going to do in 2026. And so my hope is that in the coming year, we're going to use this as an opportunity to start making plans and getting things moving. And so I want to kind of talk about some of those things. Let's go back and look at what they did back in the bicentennial in 1976, right? What are the cool things that came out of that? What kind of things can we do this, with the upcoming celebration in a little over a year now? That we can document the history and leave this, and how can you get involved and that sort of thing. So there'll be other things that we'll talk about too. other things that'll pop up. And certainly, if there's a burning question, feel free to reach out to us. Who knows? Maybe, we'll do the history of another name of another place. If you have suggestions for, what namesake you'd want to hear, always interesting to hear those thoughts and suggestions. But in the meantime, I think I'm going to call it here because I've already talked for far too long. I was really trying to keep this to like half an hour. That's okay. Like I said, it's been a while, and if you're still watching, hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm gonna stop rambling here. I'm actually pre-recording this before the date that it's going to go live because apparently it's going to be very snowy tomorrow. So I'm going to get this uploaded, and I hope if you're watching this the day it comes out, that you're warm and comfortable, and all of that. And yeah, happy end of the year. I hope you had a good 2024, and wish you all a happy new year and the holidays here at the end of the year. Is this how I normally end it? Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time with some more history chats, whenever that'll be. Soon, though.